Sitting down to drink my morning coffee, I think about the beans that were likely grown in Brazil. My breakfast has chocolate flakes in it. The cacao in those could be coming from Côte d'Ivoire. And I scroll to read American news on a phone that was likely manufactured in China. We live in such a globalized world nowadays that we hardly even notice it anymore. And oftentimes, we consider it to be a pretty new phenomenon without any deep history. But actually, globalization is much older than we think, and we encounter these processes all along history where humans have been interconnected. Let's talk to Robert Rollinger, professor of ancient history and ancient Near Eastern history at the University of Innsbruck, about 5 examples from across Eurasia that show these really early forms of globalization.
We start with the horse. The domestication of the horse is one of the most important examples of proto-globalization in world history. With the domestication of horse, time and space have been contracted in an extraordinary way, opening up new worldviews, but also bringing people together politically, economically and socially. We know nowadays that this process of domestications already started in the 4th millennium BCE, with an important step around 2000 BCE, where a specific breed of horses has been introduced, and then moving forward to the invention of cavalry units, the invention of horse riding, which started about at the end of the 2nd millennium BCE, when we see at the turn from the 2nd to the 1st millennium BCE that horse riding, especially in military affairs, became much more important from the east of the Eurasian continent to the west of the Eurasian continent. And it is not by chance that the earliest examples, or let's say one of the earlier examples for this invention, we find in the early history of empires, starting with the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BC and continuing for a long period of time with important testimonies in the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest empire of antiquity.
Initially, horses were used to pull carts and chariots, but horse riding first appears on Neo-Assyrian reliefs in the 9th century BCE. And from then on, we see new and different riding techniques, saddle technology, and military equipment connected to horse riding. The contraction of time and space that Professor Rollinger was talking about is made clear in these archives of Achaemenid Persian kings in Persepolis in around the 7th century BCE. They had a system of courier riders that connected their huge empire between today's Afghanistan and the Eastern Mediterranean in record time. Through that, the regions were contracted, brought together, and it made ruling them a lot easier for the Achaemenids. Let's move on to number 2.
It is a carpet, a rug, originating from a very famous cemetery in eastern, nowadays, Russia, called Pasirik, where we have important examples of burials of local elites. And together with these local elites, artifacts, but also horses again, have been buried, showing their prestige which they had during lifetime. What we see here is the earliest preserved example of a carpet. And the tomb dates roughly around 300 BCE, but the specimen you see here, the artifact, belongs to the 4th century BCE. What we see is especially interest in the fact that we recognize motifs, especially horses, horse riders, and the equipment, the dress, the accoutrement of the riders, that could originate immediately from Old Persian context, Achaemenid Persian context, in nowadays Iran.
This might all sound familiar to you if we watched our previous video. Back then, I only mentioned the carpet briefly, but we did talk about imperial reach and what happens in an empire's borderlands. If you're interested in what that means, I highly recommend you watch that video after this one. For now, let's look at our next example. Number 3 brings us closer west into Europe, to Austria in the Roman period around the 2nd century CE. The artifact we're talking about is a knife handle made of ivory. What's so special about it?
When this piece was found, nobody paid close attention to the signs that you can see on this handle. But as an expert in Indian writing systems has now revealed, it is an Indian writing system that is called a Kharoshthi writing system. So the piece is originating in India. And this gives us interesting insight into a globalized world, this time during the period of the Roman Empire, where trade between Roman Empire on the one hand and India on the other hand was flourishing. We have in the meantime a whole bunch of sources that document the flourishing and the importance of this luxury trade between East and West about 1,800 years ago. And we see that specimens of this trade were not only imported in the great centers of the Roman Empire like Rome, Alexandria and other places, but also in provincial towns.
And what does the text say?
The inscription refers to an Indian noble, probably an Indian king, and it is probably a gift that was offered by this Indian king, by this Indian noble to an important follower. How this gift came in the end to the West, we do not know.
For number 4, we're moving back to Asia, to what's now Western China, the Yingpan Cemetery, along what was once the Silk Roads. This is the Yingpan man, a mummy found in a richly decorated tomb, buried sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries AD.
What is interesting with this so-called Yingpan man are the artifacts, because obviously this was a very rich, a very noble man, that intended to take all his prestige, all his social standing with him into the other world, into the tomb. He had artifacts with him that originate, on the one hand, from Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia, from southern Russia, and from the Mediterranean, from the Roman Empire. Let's just take an example. You see that this mummy is wearing a very noble attire, a so-called kaftan, that clearly originates in Eastern Asia. But the motifs on this kaftan are winged butai, winged small angels that clearly have their origin in the context of the Roman Empire.
Mediterranean imagery in Asia, that sounds familiar. We also discussed an example of this in my previous video. But finally, let's take a look at number 5. Grilled chicken with fries and ketchup. That doesn't seem to fit with the others, but if you think about it, any food we consume has a really deep history. And if we look closely, we suddenly see an interconnected, proto-globalized, entangled world that leads us into deep historical connectivity some thousands of years ago.
Let's just pick up some examples from this nice meal. The chicken. We now know that the domestication of the chicken started roughly in the second half of the 2nd millennium BCE in southeastern Asia. It was originally a fowl whose living place was in the jungle, but by the introduction of agriculture in southeastern Asia, this bird moved out of the jungle, was looking for staying close to human beings and became domesticated this way. And we know that already in the probably in the end of the 2nd millennium, this domesticated animal moved from southeastern Asia to India, and in the 1st millennium, probably during the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, so it is roughly speaking in the 6th and 5th century BC, towards the Middle East. And from there, the journey of the domesticated chicken started further on to the west. We have testimonies for chicken already in archaic and classical Greece. And then it was introduced in Rome, probably during the time of the Roman Republic, so let's say roughly in the 1st century BCE. And from there it moved further to the west until we have examples of domesticated chicken in nowadays Great Britain in late antiquity, let's say in the 4th and 5th century BCE. Of course, the potato and the ketchup leads us to a completely other direction. It leads us to the ancient Americas. That is the time before Western Europeans came to the Americas. The potato, but also the tomato, are plants that originate in America, in these Americas, and that were introduced in the 16th century to Europe and revolutionized the consumption habits of the West. The lemon. The lemon leads us back to Asia again. We now know that the lemon originate in the southern hills of the Himalaya mountains, and it is one of the first citron fruits that made their ways from Eastern Asia to the Mediterranean. We have the first examples again in nowadays Israel around the 6th and 5th century BC. So again, during the Persian Achaemenid Empire, where we see that the lemon has been moving from Eastern Asia to the Middle East, and from there, of course, then further to the West.
We've now looked at a lot of examples of proto-globalization that stretch back thousands of years. Everything is connected if you dig deep enough. The contraction of time and space happens when things that seemed far away suddenly come within reach, and for them to be connected easier. Think of what the invention of the phone did to communication compared to writing letters before. We see all these phenomena in ancient times already, like the domestication of animals and plants. After all, my Brazilian coffee beans come from a plant that originates in Africa, and my Côte d'Ivoire cacao, well, that's an American plant. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new today and that we'll see you again next time.